Hello again, and I would say welcome back to Spiritual Self-Care, or another episode of Spiritual Self-Care, as I've been prefacing with like every video for months now. But I've decided I'm getting a bit bored talking about spiritual self-care, and I feel like we've exhausted a lot of the content. Not that there's not more that could be said, but I just kind of realized that I'm getting a bit bored talking about this all the time. And if the guy talking to the camera is getting a bit bored talking about this all the time, maybe the people watching through the screen are getting a bit bored watching the board guy talk about stuff on the YouTubes and the Facebooks. So why don't we launch into a new series, and we may come back to the spiritual self-care stuff, because there's always, again, more that could be said, but maybe it's something that would be worthwhile revisiting some months down the road with some fresh perspective and some new ideas, right? What does it look like to do spiritual self-care on the other side of global pandemic? That would be interesting, actually, but we need to get several months down the road in order to revisit that one. Starting today, I would like to start a new series, and I want to come out with a good title, because it took me forever to come up with a good title for the last series, Spiritual Self-Care, Praying Through the Pandemic. That's good. It took me months to get there. So let's come up with a good title right out of the gate. To tell you the essence of what I want to talk about, I want to talk about what it means to be Episcopalian. So why don't we title this new series Episcopal Identity, or Episcopalian Identity. The reason I want to do this series, one, is because I've been really reflecting a lot on what does it mean to be an Episcopalian priest, a member of the Episcopal Church during these times. But I've also have been receiving, as a priest, a lot of questions, a lot of just curious inquiries about what do we Episcopalians believe about certain things? What does this priest believe about certain things? And how does our tradition speak to kind of like the world and where it's at currently and where it's going in the future? And I've been speaking a lot, with a lot of kind of evangelicals recently who are kind of doing this thing. It's kind of a sexy word these days. They're doing this kind of deconstruction. They're deconstructing their faith, deconstructing a lot of the worldviews and the notions they were brought up in the evangelical world. And I think they're looking not just to deconstruct and stay there and just like tear the house down, right? Because they realized it wasn't really a good house or welcoming house or hospitable house or loving house to live in. I think they're looking for something more. They don't want to just tear the house down. They want to reconstruct something. And so they're reaching out and asking, how are we Episcopalians different from what they experienced growing up or in the context that they're coming out of? And since I've been having so many conversations with people recently about this, I thought maybe we can put some of this subject matter, right, up on the YouTubes and the Facebooks. Because I figured if there's a few folks that are kind of poking us on the shoulder and asking, what do you all believe about such and such? Maybe there's more that haven't felt courageous enough to ask those questions or to reach out. Or maybe, as it was the case with me so many years ago, maybe there was like these underlying questions that were there. I just didn't really know how to articulate them or vocalize them. So I thought maybe it would be helpful. If nothing else, it'll help sharpen this priest. So what does it mean to be Episcopalian? What is our Episcopal identity? That is a very hard question to answer, even for an ordained person. It depends on how you approach it and where you're asking the question from. What are you looking for? Are you looking for spirituality? Are you looking for a social ethic, a moral code? Are you looking for a different kind of theology? Are you looking at it through the lens of history? Because, I mean, all of that really matters. So we could say that, you know, for example, let's take the history thing. We are the Episcopal Church that are a part of the Anglican Church worldwide. The Anglican Church, of course, coming from the Church of England, was a break-off of the Roman Catholic Church, you know, that goes back, you know, thousands of years. But if we just said that's what it means to be Episcopalian, that wouldn't cut it. Nobody really resonates with that. I mean, it's a part of our history, but would we say that's a part of our Episcopal identity? I don't think most folks in the congregation would say so, because we've evolved so much throughout the course of history. So just looking back on history, it doesn't really capture the ethos or the essence of who we are. Nor does just purely keeping things on an intellectual level or like a theological level. What do Episcopalians believe? That also is a good question. I think Episcopalians could tell you more about what they don't believe as opposed to what they do believe in. We hold to a pretty narrow center, something quite small in terms of what you're required. And even that word required has quotation marks around it, because I don't know if we're really required to believe anything in so many ways these days in the Episcopal Church. There's a lot of theological flexibility in terms of what you can believe and still get away with being an Episcopalian. And I'll say get away with. I'll leave it there. But just an example, I mean, there's so many people in the Episcopal Church who have come out of like a more conservative background, and they have full-blown rejected most of what they were brought up with. And they've kind of swung in the more progressive liberal direction, and it's kind of this reaction against their conservative upbringing. In many ways, I fall into that category because I've really rejected a lot of my conservative experiences and my own Christian journey. But there's other folks I know, for example, who were in my parish who grew up more conservative in a more conservative Christian environment, but don't feel the need to reject all of it outright and still carry a lot of that into their Episcopalianness. And part of what makes the Episcopal identity so interesting these days especially is the majority of Episcopalians did not grow up Episcopalian. So there's people who bring certain things to the table that weren't necessarily a part of the Episcopal tradition before, and there's ways in which Episcopal churches tend to absorb some of these ideas and traditions. Should it be that way? Some people would argue no. Some people think it's a beautiful thing. I'll leave that for you to decide. So again, it's really hard to narrow down what does it mean to be an Episcopalian. And I think one of the things that's been a part of our ethos from the beginning, and I'll unpack this more as the weeks go by, but is that we've been more about being a people of prayer than we've been about being a people of a really set in stone belief system. So even in our tradition, you've had kind of this ebb and flow between kind of more evangelicalism or Protestantism and Catholicism. So like when we broke away, the Anglican Episcopalian Church broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, it didn't want to go as hardcore against the Catholic identity as did like the Lutherans, for example, and some of the Reformed traditions, which is why when you come to an Episcopal church, and especially if you've been Catholic or you've gone to any number of Catholic churches in your lifetime, it feels pretty Catholic still, right? I mean, the priest is in like a dress, all of the gowns, right? There's all of this ritual around the Eucharist. We still even refer to the Eucharist as the Mass in many of our churches. There's a lot of Catholicness, but then you hear the preaching and you hear a lot of like Lutheranness, even sometimes some Baptistness. It's really interesting. But it's mainly because we've been more about being a people of prayer, which is why one of the central things we have is the Book of Common Prayer. It's really prayer that unites us more than anything. Yeah. And there's an allowance for a diversity of opinions, a diversity of theologies, of spiritualities, of political identities even, within that, and it's actually quite beautiful. It can also be very frustrating when you're trying to get unity on an issue, right? And if you have people coming from all over the place. But it's still one of our core convictions that prayer will get you to a place of unity much quicker than trying to get to unity through the head and through argumentation and through intellectualizing everything. So yeah. We're a people of prayer. What's central to the Episcopal identity? We pray. And we have the Book of Common Prayer that helps us get steeped ever further and ever more deeply into prayer. I'm going to leave it there for now. I want to say so much more, but I see it's like 10 minutes already. So we'll pick up next week and we'll talk more about Episcopalian liturgy and prayer and worship and how that differs in some ways from other traditions and makes us unique. Thanks for tuning in once again. God bless you. Peace.